Welcome back to Normal Islands Live. I'm Curtis Daly, and I'm joined by good friend of the show, Helena, aka No Justice MGG. Helena, how are you feeling tonight?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Had a pretty easy day today. After a pretty quiet weekend as well. So looking forward to the show tonight.
Strange to hear that you've had a quiet weekend because you're always quite busy, but I'm sure we will. There'll be more things coming up for you. Now, just to let you know that things may look slightly different as we are trying out some new software. And over the next couple of weeks, you may see variations as we flick back and forth between the old one and the new one. This is because we at Turn Left always want to improve and become more and more professional. Now, let's get on to the stories. Tonight, we will be covering Labour's plans to build more by slashing regulations. Kemi Badenoch causes controversy with autism comments. And finally, footage has emerged of people, including children, being burnt alive after an attack on a hospital by Israel. First up, the Labour Party will be announcing their new investment strategy by cutting red tape. Keir Starmer will promise to slash red tape and rip out the bureaucracy that blocks investment as he hosts hundreds of global business executives for a major summit in central London. After a troubled run-up to the event, including a bruising row with a Dubai-based owner of P&O Ferries, the Prime Minister will urge the world's largest businesses to invest in the UK, promising them stable policy and low regulation as an incentive to do so. Starmer will say in his keynote speech on Monday, "We've got to look at regulation where it is needlessly holding back the investment to take our country forward. Where it is stopping us building the homes, the data centres, warehouses, grid connectors, roads, train lines, you name it, then mark my words, we will get rid of it. We will rip out the bureaucracy that blocks investment, and we will make sure that every regulator in this country take growth as seriously as this room does." Now, this isn't exactly a new argument. In fact, this is all I've heard for decades. It was one of the most prominent arguments for Brexit, and it is incredibly similar as to what David Cameron was calling for back when he was Prime Minister. Essentially, many right-wing politicians have been pushing for more deregulation, and here is the leader of the Labour Party calling for the same thing. Helena, obviously, when taken at face value, this is a classic neoliberal policy of deregulation to woo capital, as we know. That cost of deregulation can be incredibly high, namely Grenfell, in which politicians poured their hearts out over recently as it was the anniversary. So do you think this is more of the same neoliberal economic policy? Is this the type of thing that could see another Grenfell? Or is this a necessary move because we know there are some issues such as planning permission? That can get quite bureaucratic. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, most regulations are in place for a reason, right? One of the things that was proposed by the Conservative government previously was removing a bunch of environmental regulations or changing the onus of the environmental regulations to be put upon local authorities rather than on construction companies when they were building new housing estates, which of course would mean that the environment would suffer because, again, these are all externalities that capital doesn't take an account for. When you're engaging in a market transaction, an externality is any outcome of that market transaction that doesn't affect the two parties between them. So, for example, people who are selling the land to be able to use for construction and the government, right? If they get rid of that regulation, they are removing that externality because, again, their partner in this transaction, the capitalist within that market transaction, doesn't actually care about whether or not there is environmental damage or there are lax building regulations that mean that we get another kind of Grenfell because that environmental damage or that loss of human life, that is irrelevant as per the profit and loss of the company in that instance. So when we have these regulations, they are specifically there to protect against those externalities. And if we continue to remove regulations, we'll continue to see more of those things happen over time. Now, as you say, I do also 100% agree with you, Curtis, when you say, oh, well, also on the other hand, we have not regulations specifically, but blockages in the planning sector,
Mm.
which Keir Starmer and Labour Party have clearly been pretty they focused on pretty heavily during the election campaign the idea that they're going to be backing the builders and not the blockers when they get into government. And this is something that I broadly agree with. I get frustrated with the NIMBY nation, as
Hmm.
people have definitely seen in my comments previously and things that I've said, especially when we covered like the Green Conference on the channel, again, a party that I am the member of. And I think it's very fair to say, well, given the local planning consent model has led to 14, almost actually 30 years really of stagnation, we've not had a new reservoir built in this country since 1992. And whilst, of course, the capitalists who own the water industry haven't wanted to do that investment anyway, even when they try to do the investment, in the very few instances that they do, these all things get blocked by local residents. And so I'm pretty Jinping pilled, let's say, in terms of allowing the state
Hmm.
specifically to mark projects as being of national importance, therefore overriding local planning consent models to ensure these things get built. Because, of course, as long as you have good state regulation to ensure that you don't have something going wrong in the neighborhood because the capitalist doesn't have to care about whether or not they cause environmental damage, for example, then that's fine. But, of course, they're also saying they want to get rid of those regulations too, and that's where I draw the line.
Yeah, because I'm frustrated as well when it comes to house building, and absolutely there are some bureaucratic planning permissions, and that's often people complain to the local council, and even if they're not upheld, it slows the process down. I mean, let's be honest. I'm sure people watching have had this experience where someone decides to, put in some sort of not complaint, but they'll say, "I object to this planning," and it could be for the most mundane, silly reason, but that slows the entire process down. But the thing that tells me that this is just a neoliberal policy is because, yes, he does mention homes, right? And again, tweaking some planning reform is fine. But he's talking about overall infrastructure, which to me sounds like it could be a bonfire of important regulation. So I want to ask, will this even bring in investment? I mean, does the policy of deregulation even work? Is this the only thing they can do, given that it seems Labour isn't keen on investments led by the state?
I mean, if you are going to get rid of state investment and expect the private sector to be able to pick up the slack, anything that would make it easier for them to make money is something that's going to make them more likely to invest, right? When you make an investment, you're doing it because you expect a return on investment.
Mm.
Again, the externalities are irrelevant to you, and therefore, if the state makes it easier for you to make money, then you're more likely to make that investment. But then you've got to think, well, is that infrastructure actually going to be properly for the public good? There's been plenty of coverage in the news and within the print media, especially around the talks between Rachel Reeves and certain kind of private investment firms or people who are in hedge funds, for example. I mean, they just got a big donation from a hedge fund, or indeed the asset managers like BlackRock in trying to get them to finance a lot of these new infrastructure. We have access to like an infrastructure bank, but that's only dealing in like single £1 billion worth of infrastructure investments. And that isn't going to be good enough, even if they change the fiscal rules to allow that to expand somewhat. And so they're going to rely on having these huge private equity on asset management firms own a bunch of our infrastructure. So is that new infrastructure that they potentially do create? If that is something that does get built for private interest and private ownership, like how much is that actually going to properly benefit the population? If indeed they start doing it for private gain, depending on the size of the contract that they get, what's the cost going to be? Is it actually going to be in a position where it's going to be for the use of everybody rather than just those who can afford to use it? Which is, of course, one of the beneficial parts of state investment in infrastructure is that you can ensure it's being done for the public good and in some cases free at the point of use, or at least minimal cost at the point of use, which you don't necessarily get from a private investment firm. There was a recent infrastructure project that was happening in London recently. I forget which one it was, which literally could have been done by the council, but was being sold off to some private owner who was going to get 100-year access to the revenues that are generated from
Was
that.
that to
So
do with the
all
toll
it's going to
bridge?
be, yeah,
And
I
they
believe
had
that
like
was
a
the one.
99 or 100-year lease, didn't they?
Yeah. So that's exactly what's going to happen, I believe, if we allow us to sell off our future infrastructure to BlackRock. And even then, you can't even necessarily ensure that this infrastructure stays for public use all that time if the private interests believe it shouldn't be in future. They are the ones who have control over this. And when it's infrastructure, this is critical for the functioning of our society. We've seen what happens when you let critical infrastructure fall into the hands of unscrupulous private companies. They weaponize it like places like the Macquarie did, the private investment firm, who used it to be able to take on debt under the company, under the banner of the company, pay off their shareholders, and then scarper later on, leaving again the public to have to pay down those debts to be able to in increased bills or increased service charges for that existing infrastructure. So this is why state ownership is really important, especially in a time of geopolitical instability, because you need to ensure that the public, actually have ownership and access to that new infrastructure. You cannot guarantee that you stay in the good graces of those private companies for long, because if they decide they don't want to use that infrastructure anymore, they can make that decision all they want because it's theirs to do what they want with, because they're the ones who own it rather than the people.
And it's a real short-term policy if you think about it, because and that's essentially it always returns me back to PFI, right? Which is that we can get lots and lots of capital to build these things, and it makes us look really, really good. Because sometimes the issues of privatization can take its time to really sink into the cracks to emerge, and often that government is now gone. And you can blame the failures, what happens afterwards, not on the root cause, but what's happening today. So we can say, well, Thames Water is completely broken, and you might get opportunist politicians to say the Labour government is useless, but really it's the root cause of it. So it really is a short-term policy. Now, we are often told, us leftists, that we're ideological because we believe that state-led investment is probably the best thing. I think it is the best thing. I think it's the most cost-effective, but it's also the best well-run. You don't get issues with investment being sucked out for profit. All these things. And we're told we're ideological, that we're going to burden people with debt because we're going to spend so much money. And then politicians continue to go to private capital to fund these projects. Okay, for the first couple of years, everything looks nice and shiny, but give it a while and the cracks emerge. What's actually happening here is, whether it's a Keir Starmer-led Labour Party, whether it's a David Cameron-led Conservative Party, that is completely ideological. They're wedded to the private sector. They love privatisation. And actually, using the state to fund things, that's the practical solution, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, like, what happens when you try and entice private companies in by saying, "Oh, look, low regulations"? You end up
Mm.
with free ports. You end up with special economic zones. I don't know if anyone looks into what workers' rights look like, and I don't know the special economic zones in China, for example. Now, I don't think there's particularly good workers' rights there, or the suicide nets that people talk about, because again, if you deregulate, the externality is going to come in things that aren't relevant to the interests of these businesses, which is, of course,
Mm.
the livelihoods of the people who are supposed to live in these areas. So, you almost certainly allow yourself to give up some amount of public interest in the pursuit of private profit. Those things are two things that are in conflict, the public interest and private profit. And so minimizing private profit maximizes public interest and vice versa.
Well, I mean, the treatment of workers, how happy they are, how some of them die, is something that's quantifiable, but it's not quantifiable in the interest of capital or the CEOs. I mean, I've never been in the boardroom, but I can imagine they don't often talk about how is our workers doing, how are they feeling, are they getting what they need. Often it's what's our growth, what's our profit, what's our turnover. That's it. So yeah, I mean, there's a public interest there that's being completely ignored. It's not just that crumbling infrastructure happens through privatisation; it does, but the workers themselves are how they're treated. And it's funny coming from the Labour Party, a party that's supposed to stand up for Labour, but once again they're continuing neoliberalism. But we are going to move on, and we will move on to our second story. This time it's about Kemi Badenoch. Now, Kemi Badenoch has caused a big controversy with her campaign material, specifically a pamphlet. Now, within it, it's stated that autistic people get better treatment and better economic privileges and protections. A pamphlet published by Badenoch's campaign team at the Conservative Party conference argued that conditions such as anxiety, as well as autism and autism diagnosis, had gone from something people should work on themselves as individuals to something that society, schools, and employers have to adapt around. The 36-page essay titled Conservatism in Crisis claims to identify factors holding back economic growth. It was not written solely by Badenoch, but it features her campaign branding throughout, and she promoted it at conference fringe events. Now, this is really quite astonishing. I mean, I think the most disgraceful part is the suggestion that those with anxiety and autism should work on themselves rather than society stepping in and helping. Now, autism is not a mental health issue, it is a disability. You can't work on yourself in terms of autism, whatever that means. I mean, I feel like that's a dog whistle to tell people to mask better, which those who have autism, they mask every single day. It's very draining. Now, with anxiety, the idea that people aren't trying to individually improve their mental health is absurd. People try their best to improve their own mental health. But once again, the suggestion is that society has stepped in too much. Helena, it's some really disgusting campaign material. I don't think there's a flaw in how low the Conservatives will go. And it seems like the individualism narrative has become so pervasive that they're even using it to attack people with mental health and disabilities.
Well, the thing is, what I think the problem is with Kemi Badenoch is that, I mean, even outside of like an ideological mindset that she's got, if she genuinely believes a lot of the things that she's saying because of she's ideologically motivated to do so, is that for a lot of people on the right at the moment, what they can't do broadly is admit that a lot of the problems in society have been caused by the beliefs they have on the economic policy that they support. So, for example, in Kemi's Renewal 2030 document, she seemed to claim that a bunch of these kind of cultural changes that we live in, for example, were the had led to economic decline. Like she tried to blame gay marriage for economic decline, all these different kind of cultural changes over the past 50 years, for example. And the reason why that she's obsessed with this stuff is because she doesn't have any real problems. This is what I noticed from the Reform UK conference as well, because they're all obsessed with the culture war too. They're all obsessed with trying to demonize certain minority groups or try and pin the blame for some other things, for example, on a particular minority group rather than looking at the economic system. And they cheered a lot at the Reform UK conference. Everything cultural related and nothing economics related. And again, it's the reality is because they haven't got any real problems, so they have to be able to sublimate any of the issues that we're seeing in the economy onto what they perceive to be as some kind of breakage apart of society, without realizing that it's them. They're the ones who broke apart society. They're the ones who have led us to this point where everything is kind of falling apart, and they can't necessarily critique the religious scripture of Thatcherism they adhere
Mm.
to. So they've got to find scapegoats as to be the
Mm.
problem here. Obviously, with Kemi Badenoch, she will attack the disabled, she'll attack trans people, she'll attack ethnic minorities. She'll find different out groups that she can demonize as somehow the fault for the malaise that we live in, and yet she can't see that patient zero is the ideology the ideology that she supports. I mean, she said to the Daily Telegraph that her political hero is Margaret Thatcher, and that's all it needs to tell you, really.
I mean, she went on air a few months ago saying that she's someone who really thinks about what she says. She's very careful with her words, and there's never anything that she regrets. And since she made that interview, she's made so many statements which are absolutely insane. And this is just a long list of them. Now, look, a lot of people seem to think that it's a good idea, or it's good that Robert Jenrick or Kemi Badenoch will be the Tory leader, because it means the Conservatives are far less likely for them to come back in power. They're less electable. But for me, this is the way I see it. Right, the way I see it is that the Tories are out of power for a very long time, regardless. But the problem is that having a more extreme Tory leader, I think, will mean the debate will be shifted even further to the right. And given the fact that Labour are all too happy to allow that to happen, that this is in fact, to me, a worse scenario than if it were to be someone like James Cleverly. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I absolutely 100% agree. Yeah. What we saw throughout the entirety of the election period, when we were all desperate for Labour to try and create their own narrative, to
Mm.
try and at least move the conversation leftwards. Of course, they weren't ever going to, because they're quite right wing and the Labour right, who now have dictatorial control of the party. But one of the things that we would have wanted them to do would be to try and shift the conversation leftward, rather than allow the Conservative Party to dictate what the terms of the discussion was, to be the arbiters of what the zeitgeist must be. No, they just followed along. They followed along and said, well, they're going to talk about the economy, so we can't say we're investing too much because then we might lose the election. Well, they're talking about stopping the boats. Well, we're much better at stopping the boats than they are. They don't have a plan for stopping the boats. We do. Rather than saying, well, actually, no, let's stop talking about the boats because that's irrelevant. What we need to talk about is the National Health Service and how we're going to deal with the cost of living crisis. They didn't really touch as much on the cost of living crisis as they should. And, even Penny Mordaunt said more about the cost of living crisis during the election campaign than Labour did by trying to cut people's taxes. Not that I was ever going to do anything to
Mm.
be able to help people with the cost of living crisis, but Labour never tried to attack that. And so what's going to happen? Because Labour refuse to try and set any kind of narrative themselves and happy to be led by the framing of the right wing media, by the framing of right wing political figures, whether it is from the right, the kind of hard right, the Tories like Kemi or Jenrick, or from the far right, like people like Farage and Tice, they'll happily ape their language if they think it's electorally viable without even bothering to try and differentiate themselves rather than looking like the better Tory. Looking, because they've accepted that the narrative is that, well, the Conservatives are the adults in the room, therefore we need to follow what they say, but prove that we're better at doing. We're more efficient neoliberals. And they're never actually going to properly try and oppose them. They are completely cucked out to the media narrative, especially not when they're happy to take loads of endorsements from awful newspapers and media outlets like The Sun, or for example. Like, they're never going to allow themselves to be the people who set the zeitgeist. They will always, always, always allow it to be the Conservatives. So with Jenrick or Badenoch, you choose who goes to the camps first. Is it asylum seekers or is it
Mm.
transgender people? Who knows? Take your pick. And then whichever leader, whichever person wins the leadership contest, they will make the whatever cultural issue du jour they want part of the national discourse week after week after week. And Labour are just going to respond by saying, yes, but when you were in government, you did nothing about this. We're sorting this out now. And then they'll just move further right. I mean, I guess what that does mean is there'll be a space opening up on the left to challenge them on genuinely progressive issues. But if we don't have the platform to be able to have our message be heard by people, all they're going to hear is this awful echo chamber right wing nonsense coming from the Starmer's Labour Party and Badenoch or Jenrick's Conservative Party. And that sounds very grim to me.
And that's the problem when you attack the Conservatives on just competency, because you just said something there which is really true, which is that if they were to come up with a culture war, Starmer would literally come out and say, well, you had your chance in government to sort things out and we're going to do it better. But there's no ideological difference. Labour should be fighting on the ideological front. They should be saying your ideas are bad, your worldview is bad. Here's our worldview, and it's a much more equal society, something like that. But they won't do that because they have no ideology apart from serving capital. You are right, obviously it leaves space on the left, but here's the issue. That's been like that for a couple of years, and the media are largely focusing on reform, the Conservatives and Labour. The Greens are being ignored, so it's very, very difficult for them to get some headway there. And now, in terms of reform, we're already seeing voters going from Labour to reform. So obviously, they're trying to fight reform on their own terrain. They're trying to be tough on immigration. They've accepted that narrative, and it's not even working. There's a lot of local elections and by-elections. That's okay. The Greens have definitely done well from it, but you're seeing a lot of swing from the Labour Party to reform. Some polling suggests that Luke Akehurst could lose, which sounds good to me. But then when you hear it's actually going to be a reform candidate taking his place, that's not so good. Other cabinet, other cabinet members looking like they could lose their seats to reform. So despite them trying to fight reform on their own terrain, all you're doing is solidifying the narrative, and people trust them on that. So you're just quite literally saying to people, yes, reform are right, please vote for them. It's really, really insane, isn't it? Now, I just want to say that before we move on, if you're watching and you're enjoying the show, please make sure you hit the like button, as I said earlier. It does help with the algorithm. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and share our content. Now, all of us at Turn Left are still completely voluntary. And one day we would like for us to become full-time and have full-time jobs at Turn Left. So if you can, please head over to turnleftmedia.co.uk/supports. There you can support us monthly or any one-off donation. Thank you very much. And I think we'll go to some of our comments. Let's see if we can get any up now. SFM is the dog. As someone with autism, I'd love to fix myself or not. I know, I think it's a really... even the framing from Badenoch and the campaign team is like something that you need to fix as well. But the society and the state should be offering support for anyone. It's just a disgusting individualist argument, which is... it's beyond words. Let's go to another comment. Les Watts, all that red tape that keeps us safe and gives us good working conditions, all that rubbish. Yeah, precisely. As Helena was saying, it's bad for the public good in terms of infrastructure breaking down, because that's ultimately what's going to happen, or seeing public money being siphoned to the pockets of the very rich, but also workers themselves. I want workers to be paid well. I want them to have good conditions. But that's not going to happen when you rely on the private sector, because their role is to generate as much profit and is to spend as little as possible, and that means wages. Let's go to another. Double D, the Conservative membership might like Kemi, but there is no chance the great unwashed Tory votership will take to her. I'm unable to put my finger on exactly why, though. Well, I mean, I think that's obviously one factor, but another factor is that the voters are not as right-wing as the membership. So Kemi and Badenoch and Robert Jenrick will absolutely appeal to members, won't they? But they're not going to appeal to the wider electorate. But obviously, as me and Helena were discussing, for me anyway, I think it's more of a worry that they can shift the debate rather than win. I'm not worried about the Conservatives winning, because I don't see them winning, not for a very, very long time, if ever. But they are still in opposition. They can set the terms of the debate. And of course, Keir Starmer is very much happy to be led by that. So we have another one. Sarah Jessica Farter, good to see you again. Always a banger name. An example is how Starmer's smash the gangs was his answer to stop the boats. He is led by the Tories. He just follows in their slipstream. Absolutely, he is led by the Tories. And that's why, ideologically, he is no different to the Conservative Party. So that's why, notice whenever the Labour Party under Starmer attack the Conservatives, it's always on competency, or you didn't do this when you were in government. But I don't want you just to attack the Tories on competency. I want you to attack them on their ideas. But clearly, his ideas are very similar. Now, that is all for our comments. Thank you so much for dropping one in. Make sure you continue to leave a comment, and we will be reading them anyway, especially after the show. But we are going to move on to our final story of the evening. Now, footage has emerged showing Gazans, including children, being burnt alive after an attack on the Al-Qasr hospital by Israel. Israeli fighter jets bombed a hospital in central Gaza overnight, killing at least 4 people in a fire which ravaged a tented area sheltering displaced Palestinians. Footage showed at least one person moving among the flames as bystanders and rescue workers screamed desperately and attempted to put out the blaze with hose pipes and buckets of water. Children were shown among the wounded, and a man sobbed as he carried a toddler with a bandaged head in his arms. At least 4 people died in the strike on the Al-Qasr Martyrs Hospital in Deir al-Balah, with the death toll expected to rise, according to the Gaza Health Ministry. The Israeli Defense Forces said it had conducted a precise strike on a Hamas command and control center embedded within a compound that previously served as the Al-Qasr Hospital. The compound was used by Hamas terrorists to plan and execute terrorist attacks against IDF troops and the State of Israel, the military said. It insisted that it had taken numerous steps to mitigate the risk of harming civilians, including the use of precise munitions and aerial surveillance and additional intelligence. Of course, Israel there shamelessly acting as if this is a Hamas territory again, and they engaged in precision strikes, which clearly they did not do. Now, we have a clip of this footage, but extreme warning. This is distressing. Please look away and mute if you do not wish to watch. There is a 5-second countdown to make sure that you don't accidentally watch it.
اقسم بالله الراجل والمرأة والبنت الصغيرة بنحرقوا قدامي والله العظيم اقسم بالله.
Now, why did we play this clip? Because I think we should. This has been happening for years, specifically ramped up since October 7th, 2023. This is the reality for Palestinians. Now, Keir Starmer has yet to say anything. There has been complete silence from our government. Now, notice how the media reports on this story. Some of it is more subtle than others, but you can see the double standard. Now, The Independent, well, they said this. Israeli soldiers killed in Hezbollah attack as airstrike kills women and children at food centre in Gaza. So when the IDF are killed, we have the victim and the perpetrator. Israeli soldiers killed by Hezbollah. Within that same headline, we have women and children being killed by an airstrike, when it should say Israel killed them. Now, NBC, they said this. Fire breaks out at Gaza hospital after Israeli strike. Now, we have the perpetrator named. It was an Israeli strike, but it's framed as a fire breaks out. It's not Palestinians killed by Israel. Now, this last one from NBC is the most revealing. Hezbollah drone attacks kills 4 Israeli soldiers while striking Gaza leaves 20 dead. So Hezbollah and the IDF are names, but within the same headline, we have 20 dead from strike. Helena, this is one of the most harrowing things to date. I want to get your thoughts on all of this, specifically how we're yet to hear from the Prime Minister, given that it didn't take him very long to condemn Iran.
I mean, we literally had a statement today from David Lamy say, well, we're imposing these sanctions on Iran after their attack on Israel. I'm like, well, they attacked a military target after being given casus belli by Israel. Okay, so if you want to put sanctions on somebody, say, for example, you want to do it because they are funding other groups in the Middle East or whatever, yeah, why are we not putting sanctions on people who just bomb hospitals? Like, remember, cast your minds back to November of last year during the Al-Ahli bombing attack in that was in the northern Gaza Strip, and there was a little bit unsure as to whether or not it was an Israeli airstrike or whether or not that there was a misfiring rocket or whatever it was. And people said online they thought that it was an Israeli airstrike or an airburst munition. It's still unsure as to what the attack even was. But the outrage, the absolute incredulity that people came to you with when you had claimed, well, there's a potential here that Israel has airstrike the hospital. They said, oh, they would never attack a hospital. How dare you insinuate it? The IDF is the most moral army in the world. And then what's happened over a year later? Here we are. There are 0 functioning hospitals left in Gaza, to the point to which even the IDF, when describing the area around the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, that was the one you saw in that quite harrowing footage, they even said a compound that used to be used as, or used to be part of, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Gaza. So there's not even a hospital left. Because again, literally no hospitals in Gaza are now functional. They paved over multiple hospitals to be able to create the Netzarim corridor. It is, as has been described by independent observers, been a systematic effort to try and eliminate the healthcare facilities in Gaza. And when is this ever discussed by our politicians? When is it ever discussed by members of our government? It isn't. And when they get asked about this in Parliament, the response is always, well, we will investigate, we'll let Israel investigate for us, right? We'll let them mark their own homework. But of course, she has a right to defend herself because some reason Israel uses she/her pronouns in Keir Starmer's world. And can they ever? I mean, they had like a mealy-mouthed statement about the attacks on the peacekeepers in Lebanon, which was just, well, if there has been an attack, then we condemn it, rather than explicitly calling out what is a ridiculous attack by the IDF on UN peacekeeper positions in Lebanon, UNIFIL specifically in that area, even when they can muster up a tiny criticism of Israel. It's always couched in the idea that they should be they should be investigated rather than calling out the war crimes for what they are, especially when you compare it to the way in which they discuss Russia-Ukraine, which I'm sure is a comparison that we have made a lot. We've made a lot, how when they want to condemn Putin as a war criminal, instantly they'll happily do it. There was footage of Keir Starmer saying it on Sophie Ridge deliberately, yes, I believe Vladimir Putin is a war criminal. Or Netanyahu, the man who the ICC chief prosecutor has requested has requested an arrest warrant for war crimes. You're going to call Netanyahu a war criminal? No, 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 no. I wouldn't want to make any judgments at the moment. I can't say anything like that because, again, it's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else.
Yeah, and there's always this plausible deniability. So even if they do bring themselves to condemn, they'll say, well, if it's true, then yes, of course we condemn it. Or yes, we need to investigate what happens. And often it's Israel investigating themselves. But anyone else, Russia, Putin, anyone who's not our ally, straight away, we are quick to condemn, even if we don't even have the full facts there. Because it doesn't matter. International law doesn't matter, even to a human rights lawyer, former human rights lawyer. Innocent civilians being killed, that doesn't matter. What matters is serving our allies and being strong on our enemies, essentially. Now, I want to talk about the newspapers and the headlines. It's so evident that when reporting on Gaza, right, it's not an accident the way it's framed, right? When Palestinians are the victims from an Israeli attack, we get the passive voice. We don't really know where they were killed. Oh, a fire erupts after Israeli strike. Or people died. Do you not think it's deliberate then? Because you cannot make that mistake this many times, which tells me, people in the media specifically push this editorial line. Like writers are being told, you have to be more sympathetic to Israel. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree. There was plenty of whistleblowers who've talked about, say, for example, at CNN, at the New York Times, about the language that they are and aren't allowed to use. For example, the things like occupation weren't being allowed to use. I believe that was at the New York Times or on the CNN, one of the two, if I remember correctly. The language that they use, there were certain words that you can't even say, despite the fact that, like, the state of the Palestinian territories as being occupied by Israel has been a precedent in international law for half a century. So the idea this be something that we can't say when we're discussing a conflict, which is directly a result of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, is quite frankly ridiculous and just shows you how entirely biased our media organizations are. And you'll rightly call out the active versus passive voice, as if what the IDF have been doing in Gaza and Lebanon is something that they've been forced to do. They've had their hand forced. They have no other choice but to commit the war crimes that done, and therefore there are just externalities that happen because of them, rather than war crimes that have been clearly committed. It's always very passive, Whereas, for example, Palestinians resisting occupation, that is being described as something that they have actively done to Israel, despite the fact that that is a response, a retaliation to the illegal occupation of the territories that they inhabit. It's as simple as that. Regardless of whether or not that you think what Palestinians have done in terms of resistance is justified or not, they have committed war crimes, and that's why there is an arrest warrant or a request for arrest warrant for many Hamas leaders as well, for example. That doesn't change the fact. None of that changes the fact that those who are under a belligerent occupation have every right to resist that by military means against military targets. And so what's ridiculous when you try and say that it's terrible that Iran have attacked Israel when they attacked military targets. And this isn't me saying, this is the American State Department saying that Iran have attacked military targets. Yet again, it's one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. And that is exactly covered up in the way in which they talk about the language that they use to describe how these events have panned out throughout the conflict. Again, not just since October the 7th, but essentially throughout the entirety of the occupation from 1967 until today. And this will continue for as long as Israel is our geopolitical ally, and our politicians care far more about their mate than they do about international law, than they care about the Rome Statute, than they care broadly about maintaining international cooperation and peace. Because the biggest thing that can bring down peace in this world is the idea, in fact, that some rules can apply to somebody other and not apply to other people. I mean, what can you say? What can you say if you're somebody who is a complete neutral party in this, when the kind of crimes that Russia commits in Ukraine is being committed by Israel in Gaza, but only one side gets called out? And one side it's okay and one side it's not. Well, that means the justification for everybody committing those is there, because it's not about an actual rule being applied to everybody. It's just about trying to police the behavior of other people that you don't like. And that is the worst way of trying to bring about global cooperation and peace.
Yeah, and initially when Iran struck Israel, a lot of the narrative was they were specifically targeting civilians, which actually no one was killed apart from one Palestinian who was accidentally killed. but they were targeting military bases and their operations, whereas Israel have been just indiscriminately bombing people. That's just what they do. Now, for me, Keir Starmer, Joe Biden, and every single leader who was still supporting Israel, still sending weapons and aid, those burning children are on them. And frankly, I think they have blood on their hands. Because you cannot look at this. I mean, we just witnessed the footage tonight, right? And these people in power will have more evidence than we have probably, and yet they seem to look away and continue to fund this. So I want to say that anyone who's still supporting Israel, any governments that want to support them financially or with weapons, and that includes Keir Starmer, you have blood on your hands. Now, that is it for tonight. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Of course, I want to thank Helena again. It's always a pleasure. We will be back at the same time of 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday. I just want to shout out to some of the people who have gifted some memberships before we end, if we can bring those up now. James Holmes, 5 Turn Left memberships. Thank you so much. I mean, you're always in the chat doing this. It's so much appreciated, because obviously, again, we're still voluntary what we do, and anything helps. I believe we have one more. Am I right? Just became a member. Thank you, Ernright. Sorry, thank you, Ernright, for becoming a member. I really appreciate it, and thank you everyone who's commented, who's liked, who's shared. It means everything. But yes, we will be back on Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.